let's start. Nice to meet you. And I don't know about your backgrounds, but I was told to talk about Korean economy, and I thought about it can be a big topic, it can be a small topic, depending on how you treat it. And I thought I would talk about 4 themes regarding the Korean economy. One thing you think of immediately is growth. And then I thought about one important aspect of understanding Korean economy is 재벌, of course. And then the fertility rate, amazingly low fertility rate is also a very important aspect. And finally, I wanted to talk about some future prospects. So let's begin with growth. Do I have a mouse? Okay. The first part is growth miracle. It's a story of from rags to riches, as most of you know. 70 years ago, we went through a terrible civil war, Korean War. And it was a civil war. It was also international war. And the extent of destruction was so much that this man, General MacArthur, who led the UN forces, said to himself, it'll take them 100 years to recover from the devastation. Well, it's not 100 years yet. 70 years passed, and this is what we have become. These days, a lot of people talk about BTS. My favorite is actually Yeona Kim, as you may guess. Let's put this growth miracle into comparative perspective. This is a graph that shows GDP per capita, its movement from 1960 to 2016. Sometimes they say that South Korean per capita income was just $100 in 1960. Now it's $30,000. That's kind of, very illegitimate comparison because of price inflation. $100 back then is now worth more than 10 times now. So that kind of comparison, although frequently made, is totally illegitimate. So this is converted to real terms, that is taking care of the price inflation. And this, I wonder if you can see the pointer. 1960, I am giving the comparison with South Korea. This is how the pink one is South Korea. It's the trajectory of South Korean GDP per capita. In comparison to the world average, which is purple one, and Latin American average, the green one, which is pretty close to the world average. East Asia, as you can see, East Asia grew very fast, but not nearly as fast as South Korea. This is Africa. Africa average was substantially higher than Korea back in 1960, but then it's been quite stagnant. So the position has changed dramatically. And this is Western Europe, and this is Western offshoots. That's North America, Oceania, those countries. And they were just, advanced countries far ahead of us, but the gap has been narrowing quite dramatically. A more dramatic comparison is that I chose just a few countries from each continent: Ghana from Africa, Philippines from Asia, Argentina from Latin America, Greece from Europe. And all of these countries has a higher per capita income than Korea did in 1960. But this is what happened. So I think there are, although I don't like to actually think these are secrets, but just a phrase that I'm using. There are some important aspects of explaining why this growth miracle happened. The first thing I'd like to mention is that it's should be located within the context of East Asian growth. What I'm trying to say is that if you take a long view of economic history, China and East Asia had a very big share of world manufacturing before the European Industrial Revolution. So what I'm trying to indicate is that there have been some, historical foundations, let's say, for growth that have been prepared. And when the conditions and policies allowed, those potential was realized in a pattern that is reminiscent of flying geese in the autumn sky that you can find like this. Actually, this is not a theory, but it's just an observation about the pattern of structural transformation that's been happening in East Asia. That is, industrialization first took place in Japan, and then newly industrializing economies, one of which is Korea, along with Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, and Taiwan. I guess Chinese people don't like when I inadvertently call Taiwan a country. It's economies. So the light manufacturing is passed on to the next group and the next group, labor-intensive light manufacturing, and they move on to more sophisticated products, and then the comparative advantage changes. They are passed on to the next tier, and so on. So this kind of pattern arose. ASEAN 4 are countries like Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, etc. And then the latecomers include China, and then Vietnam and India, this kind of pattern. So Korean success story is not just a standalone story, but it is within the East Asian context. Some earlier, some faster, some later, some somewhat slower, but there has been this kind of historical growth in East Asia. Secondly, laying good social foundations for takeoff. Right after the independence from Japanese colonial rule, the Korean government, after it was established, went through a series of reforms, including first introduction of civil service exam, which established basically meritocracy. You don't have to come from aristocratic families. If you study hard and work hard, you can become a civil servant. Land reform was, of course, much more important reform. The land was given to the farmers, and because of that, farmers could increase food security and increase productivity. When their children are doing well in school, they can even sell their plots to finance the education of their children and so on. And introduction of compulsory education. This is a scene of a school that is being run during the Korean War. Koreans like to remind ourselves that we are a nation that continued to run schools even under heavy fire during the war. So dismantling landed aristocracy actually is very important in allowing adoption of policies that promote industrialization. And egalitarian distribution of income and asset laid a very good foundation for industrialization. People talk about outward orientation or export promotion. I like to call it strategic integration with global markets. It's not simply opening and let the market forces decide, but it was pretty deliberate policies to take advantage of the possibilities that the global markets allowed. I call it dynamic comparative advantage because as you saw from the earlier flying geese pattern, we continue to move onto more sophisticated, more higher value added, more capital intensive, more technology intensive industries and products. And as you can see, South Korean exports was virtually nothing, and then it increased very dramatically. But export promotion was not in and of itself a virtue. It was to finance imports. Imports was mostly capital goods with which to build industries. So there was exchange rate reform, export promotion policies, but at the same time, it was not free trade. It was also engaged in selective import protection quite heavily. And we made, to finance the gap between imports and exports, you need to borrow money from abroad, right? So utilized foreign loans a lot, but at the same time, there was strong capital controls imposed. Government's coordinated investment or industrial policy was an important aspect of Korean success. As many of you may have heard, the government made a series of 5-year economic development plans. And the government, one of the first things that Park Chung-hee did after his military coup, was to take over the commercial banks, take over the ownership and also control the management. With that control over finance and also engaged in many policies to increase domestic and foreign savings. Why? Because wanted to finance investment so that you can fulfill these development targets and industrialize rapidly. So it was, I call it a judicious mix of markets and the state. You can see that investment savings was very low, but savings continued to increase. And there was always the gap between investment and savings. This is, if you study the economics, you'll notice that this corresponds to current account deficits, which has to be financed by foreign borrowing. The gap has been narrowed as a result of continued increase in saving rate. But this rapid increase of investment, that is basically the fundamental force of rapid growth and industrialization. Number 5 is education. I know a lot of you are students. Koreans go to school, take exams, they study hard. I don't know how hard, but they spend a lot of time on it. Korea's development strategy emphasized human resources a lot, especially because we don't have much natural resources. This shows from 1970 to 2013, the rate of enrollment in South Korea's schools, primary school over 100, secondary school enrollment rates about 40% in 1971, increasing very rapidly to almost 100%. Even tertiary education, which was below 20%, now has increased over 60%, one of the highest in the world, very rapid. As a comparison, this is Japan. Japanese tertiary, this is Korean tertiary. This is Japan, from less than 20 to over 60. Korea's tertiary education enrollment rates, less than 10% here, and rising very, very rapidly and dramatically. This is, I can't believe it. I think it includes all kinds of post-secondary education of any kind, and you even approach 100%. Finally, adjustment and reforms with which to bounce back from crisis. Korean economy was not just growing steadily and rapidly and happily ever after. Not that kind of story. There have been ups and downs, as capital economists tend to do, and not only that, there were a few very, very severe financial crises, particularly at the end of 1970s or early 80s. And then there was also 1997, 98 Asian financial crisis, very severe crisis. And the important thing is that Korea was able to bounce back very quickly. And that is what put it apart from other developing countries. That, Latin American countries were doing pretty well in the 70s, but then they suffered from the lost decade in the 1980s after the famous debt crisis. And Asian financial crisis also crumbled a few countries, but Korea was able to bounce back very quickly. 재벌 economy. If you are in Korea, you cannot escape 재벌's presence. You live in apartments that is built by 재벌 firms. You consume all the 재벌-made electronics goods. You drive 재벌-made cars, and you ride in 재벌-made cars, I should say, and so on. Samsung, of course, is the biggest of them, and it's Korea's pride, and at the same time, it's our pain in the ass. With manufacturing excellence, I haven't used this one yet. I'm an iPhone user, actually, but foldable phone and microchips, and the brand power is such that this year's world's most valuable brands ranking puts Samsung brand 5th in the world. Oh, it's quite surprising. I didn't know it was as high as this until I prepared this lecture. As you probably know, 재벌 is a group of a lot of companies. It's business group or conglomerate. Its distinctive feature is it's controlled by families. And it's, if you pay the taxes, observe the laws, and so on, it's impossible to keep the control of such a large group of companies that requires a lot of equity capital to remain within the family. So 재벌 leaders have been going to jail almost without exception in Korea. Currently, Mr. Lee Jae-yong, Samsung's leader, is being tried for illegal activities during the previous government. His bribery to Park Geun-hye, and that was I don't have time to go into details, but not only that, he is now indicted again for accounting fraud, huge accounting fraud. His initial adult life began with this illegal Everland convertible bond scandal, and so on. So he's the wealthiest, one of the most powerful men in Korea, in the world, but he cannot do away with all these illegal activities because of this family control obsession. It's also accused of being an empire of greed. It's octopus-like diversification, using the monopoly power, making all kinds of abuses, unfair subcontracting practices, and treatment of its workers. Its Samsung Group is known for its anti-union stance. Reportedly, its founder said, unions over my dead body. So they've been engaged in union busting in its subsidiaries and also subcontractors, and high ranking board members actually are in jail now for this kind of illegal union busting. And leukemia victims in Samsung Electronics factories have also been treated very badly. Why did this happen? I want to talk a little bit about authoritarian developmental state. That is a kind of, characterization of the Korean government that led this growth miracle. This picture, this is cuts, it is in a stadium, cut section show. This is President Park, and this is a scene that is very North Korea-like scene, right? So it's very symbolic of the kind of regime. It's a military dictatorship, but at the same time, so, human rights, labor rights, environment, we don't care. Just, go for rapid development. That was, and if somebody says, no, you have to respect human rights. We need freedom, workers' rights should be respected. We should take care of environment. And they are all considered the enemy of the state. Even though he had dictatorial power, the level of corruption was relatively contained, and he was very focused on promoting his development plans and actually achieving those targets. So what did this do? A lot of things, but as an authoritarian state, it engaged in political repression and labor repression. As a development state, it engaged in financial repression. That is, as I mentioned earlier, ownership and control of the commercial bank, and put financial resources into those sectors that government was promoting, such as heavy and chemical industry during the 1980s. 1970s. And developmental planning with state-chaebol partnership. So even though the government made plans and government mobilized the financial resources from within and also from abroad, instead of running state-owned companies, actually Taiwan did a lot of that. But in Korean case, state-owned companies were very limited. Only POSCO, the integrated steel mill, was directly owned and run by the government. All the other industries were basically run by chaebol. So this is the origin of why Korean economy became so dominated by big chaebol. They grew a lot during this period. This is a graph that shows that during this period of rapid industrial growth under Park Chung-hee, inflation rate, this blue one is inflation rate. Inflation rate was very high, 20%, 10%, 25%, and so on. But if you go to the bank, the interest rate is much, much lower. So if you can borrow money from the bank, you just, can make money out of nothing because the real interest rate is actually negative. And so that means only, there is always excess demand for loans, and only those who are favored by the government can get the loans. Who are they? They are 재벌, in exchange for investing in the kind of industries that government plans to promote. If you go to the market, curb market, the interest rate is very, very high because you have inflation rate is high, right? The gap is real interest rate. Well, it succeeded in generating rapid growth, but there are also a lot of problems. Political repression, many people got unhappy and calls for democratization. Street demonstrations and political instabilities arose. Labor repression led to exploitation and the rise of antagonistic militant unionism. This is the famous hero of Korean labor movement, Mr. Chun Tae-il. Although I think he was at this time 20 years of age or something. He self-immolated himself, crying for labor rights, basic labor rights. Financial repression led to overheating of the economy, that is inflation, external crisis, financial crisis. State-재벌 partnership led to corruption and 재벌-dominated economy. Share of 재벌's size relative to the economy became very large during the 1970s and 80s. So things changed, of course. This is a scene from 1987, the year of democratization. This is June 10th democratization movement. And so what we achieved was, through democratization, is now we can elect our presidents with our own hands, and the election is fairly problem-free, relatively fair and free. But the political system is quite lacking in many other respects, and popular classes have limited representation in National Assembly. And one indication of the limits of Korean democracy, I think, is shown by this graph. This shows public social spending as a share of GDP from 1960 to 2016, in comparison with what's United States, Japan, and Sweden. Sweden, we know, is a very high spending, very highly developed welfare state. Japan, not so, but because of population aging, it's increasing like this. U.S. is among the rich countries, has one of the poorest welfare system, but still it's spending this much. Korea, after democratization, they began to spend more on social welfare, health, housing, etc. And still, its share is very low relative to the level of economic development it has achieved. And it's the presidential power is the power is too much concentrated in the presidency, and that can easily lead to big problems like this 박근혜 최순실 gate that we had a few years ago that led to this candlelight protest. Stabilization and liberalization. This is in relation to the financial excesses, financial repression, and then overheating of the economy. Everybody wants to get hold of money, right? Invest. So the government engaged in stabilization policies, and during the 70s, inflation rate was very high, but from this successful stabilization, inflation rates was brought down to reasonable levels, 5% up and down. And these days, of course, it's even lower. The trades was, on the one hand, there was heavy promotion of exports, and at the same time, a lot of imports were controlled, but there was gradual liberalization of trade, and also finance that was tightly in the hands of the government was liberalized gradually. After democratization, and especially in the 1990s, there was more radical liberalization of finance, industrial policy, and trade policy, because Korea aimed to become a member of the OECD, which it succeeded. In 1996, Korea became officially a member of OECD. However, that liberalization was mismanaged, and we suffered the consequence during the Asian financial crisis. Financial liberalization without adequate prudential regulation led to all kinds of problems. Market liberalization without, what I mean is, the inflow of hot money, and, we made ourselves vulnerable to flow of hot money. And that is why we had a big financial crisis. Market liberalization without adequate market discipline. This means that Korea government gave a lot of favors to chaebol firms before, but at the same time, they stayed within government plans, and they got the support only when they fulfilled export targets and other things that government wanted them to do. But now liberalization, the private sector can do whatever it wants to without interventions by the government. And then they had a lot of market power. So, and the competition and other forces of checks and balances were lacking. And that led to excessive investment by chaebol firms and rising debt equity ratios, and led to financial institutions and commercial banks ending up in very bad position. And we had this big financial crisis. And Koreans call it IMF crisis, although IMF did not create that crisis. But IMF actually gave us rescue financing, helped us get over the crisis. But still, Koreans hate IMF, like a lot of people around the world, because of the harsh conditionalities imposed in return for rescue financing. And a lot of people were fired during that time in the name of structural adjustments. So people said IMF means I am fired, or even I am fucked, and so on. Finally, chaebol. At the time, chaebol, they said chaebol was too big to fail, but because of this financial crisis, a lot of chaebol firms actually went bankrupt. Out of top 30 chaebol groups, only 15 survived. But after that, there were a lot of chaebol reforms introduced. However, only after a few years, chaebol groups started to grow in size again and dominate the industry again, creating all kinds of scandals all the time and going in and out of jail, continued to grow. So now I call it, they are too powerful to reform. So from TBTF to TPTR. That's and then I found this article in The Economist. They call it too big to play fair. But I think my phrase is even more to the point. Presidential candidates and presidents, including the current one, the previous one, and the one before, they always talk about chaebol reform and economic democracy and so on, but they end up doing virtually nothing. Well, this is about fertility. The title is Collective Suicide, because what is happening is nothing short of collective suicide. I know I'm running out of time, so I'm going to be quick. Extremely low fertility rates compared to other rich countries. Korean fertility rate is among the lowest. And the second quarter of this year, the total fertility rate was 0.82. This is just unbelievable. This should be 2.1 to maintain the size of the current size of the population. But this is what is happening, and that means population size is going to decrease, and the age structure will become such that the largest segment of the population will be those who are elderly. And Korea is expected to be the country with the highest rate of highest dependency ratio. That means old age people relative to people in productive age. 118%. This is unbelievable in 2065. So because of this population structure, Korean growth rate is expected to go down like that. So why avoid marriages and babies? There are economic factors and cultural factors. The cultural factors are also important, but I think economic factors are more fundamental. Job and income security is lacking for many young people, and cost of housing and education is too much. This is a very revealing graph. If you look at the men in their 30s and these income groups, if you belong to the poor group, only 20% is married. If you belong to the top 10%, 86% is married. So it's very much related to economic status. If you're a woman, that story is different. Still, you can see the that kind of trend. If you are richer, you marry more. But in the case of women, if you are really poor, then you marry a lot. I wonder why this is. I can guess. They cannot afford to be not to be married. Probably they are marrying men not necessarily to their liking. Good old days of rapid growth are long gone. Growth rates nowadays are no more rapid at all. Well, that is quite a natural phenomenon in a maturing economy because of declining population growth and what we call diminishing returns to capital accumulation. As capital is accumulated, its growth stimulating effect gets diminished. And dwindling opportunities for catching up, that is imitating and importing advanced technologies from abroad. So that's very natural. The problem is that all of these things are happening very, very quickly in South Korea. No other country has experienced such a rapid aging of population, such rapid diminishing returns from capital accumulation and so on. what I'm showing here is, I'm not going to explain this, but Korean investment rate is still the highest among the OECD countries. This is China, so not developing country. But growth rate cannot be sustained with this kind of investment alone. There is also Korean R&D paradox. R&D investment is also the highest level in the world, but its outcomes in terms of new technologies invented and productivity growth is not so good. And the reason for this, I believe, is because we have been the policies, business practices, and educational practices have all been geared to catching up growth. So we are used to that kind of growth, but now we have to innovate on our own, and we are doing it, but not nearly as much as we need or as might be expected from the amount of investment that we are making in this regard. So as the economy is slowing down, the income distribution is getting worse and worse. Income is being concentrated to the top 10%, top 5%, top 1%. So there is this contrast between riches and the shanty towns. Labor market inequalities are one of the highest among the OECD countries. It's neck and neck with the United States and Israel and Korea, and labor market are the most unequal labor markets in the among the richer countries. Declining social mobility, inequality is rising, and at the same time growth is slowing down, so opportunities are dwindling, and as a result, capital income, much of it coming from inheritance, that is becoming more and more important. So young people began to realize that unless you are born with a silver spoon in your mouth, it's really difficult to make it. Statistically speaking, compared to before, now the mobility, social mobility has gone down pretty much. Koreans have taken this analogy of silver spoon to extremes. They talk about gold spoon and dirt spoon. Safety nets are very inadequate. I mentioned how social spending as a share of GDP is still relatively low. Safety nets, redistribution, this kind of thing is still very low in Korea. And especially old age poverty is, I think this is really criminal. They have made all the sacrifices to bring about the growth miracle, but we're not treating them fairly. As a result, old age poverty is by far the highest, and old age people, suicide is a big problem. Not doing well in climate. This year we are suffering from the pandemic, but we are at least being compensated by clean air. But last year, because of fine dust, we suffered this kind of air too many times, partly because of this coal burning power plants and other things. Finally, reason for hope. As I said, history important. We have overcome the war, the military dictatorship, the financial crisis, corruption scandals, all kinds of big crises. So we have historical resources to cope with newly arising crisis. Korean people are very open to new ideas and changes. This is quite amazing. And many of you may have seen this promotional video from Korea Tourism Organization. Inalchi's Feel the Rhythm of Korea. I found it very funny, and it shows the extent to which Koreans are able to change, adapt to new ideas. And of course, the success against COVID-19. This is Korea. This is the second quarter contraction of GDP, and this is the COVID-19 death rate. There are countries, overall, there is this negative correlation. If more people are dead, the health crisis is severe, economy also suffers more. But there are other countries that have had relatively low death rate, but suffered a lot more in terms of the economy. Korea and Taiwan, actually, and China, I should say, are by far the best performing countries in this regard. And Korea's, there are many reasons for this relative success. I think probably the most important factor is that we have had previous exposure to this pandemic crisis. As a result, we intervened seriously and early, and testing and tracing with various innovations, and solidarity and civic participation. Almost everybody wearing masks and so on. Finally, we are trying a new beginning with Korean New Deal. Let's make some fundamental changes to, the era of miracle economy. Growth miracle is over long ago, and now we are facing difficult problems, but we have a lot of resources with which to cope with the new crisis, and we are starting anew. So that's, I started a little bit late, and I have a lot of questions, and I don't know how much time I have. I have only 5 minutes, but I can go some more if you don't mind. Jean, with few companies sharing a huge part of Korean GDP, how can we manage the eventual lobbying from these companies and avoid corruption? That's a good question. And that is why the political leaders making promises of economic democracy, eradication of corruption, collusion with big business, and reform of chaebol. They talk about that all the time, but not much has changed. I say they have structural power. Not only their illegal lobbying, but because of the share, chaebol's share of investment is actually a lot bigger than their share in GDP. And any political would like to have more economic growth, and for that they would like more investment, and for that they would like to listen to chaebol when they say, oh, you have to be nice to us. If you make too much trouble for us, we are not going to invest, right? So that gives them a lot of power. So it's not an easy problem to solve. I think the history has shown that with the current political structure, it's virtually impossible. So I think I'm one of the advocates of political reform, and only when we have much better representation of the workers and the small shopkeepers and other underprivileged people, much better in the political system, we'll be able to make serious reforms, I believe. During COVID-19, chaebol structure has contributed inequality and wealth distribution. Absolutely. A a lot of in a lot of ways, but most importantly, this the labor market inequality that I showed you earlier, which was one of the highest among the OECD countries, that is because chaebol is able to make, in economics jargon, make monopoly profits. So they're able to offer pretty high wages, but those kind of good jobs can go to only a very limited number of people, and a lot of other workers then have to suffer from this huge wage gap. Another thing is because of their dominance over the media, politicians, their influence over the academics, not me, but and so on, they make it very difficult to make fundamental economic and social reforms. I think that is also an important thing. chaebol, you are interested in chaebol, huh? All these questions have helped lift the country out of poverty. One could say so. Could their influence put the health of the Korean economy at risk in the future, as it heavily depends on them? If so, what's the role of Korean SMEs, and do they stand a chance? chaebol, I have no problem with Samsung Electronics or Hyundai Motor Company or LG Chemicals and so on. Those companies have a place in the Korean economy, and they have to play important roles in taking the Korean economy to the next level, solving the social crisis at the same time. The fundamental problem with chaebol is this family control structure. So chaebol's power is used to transfer wealth to their family members, and in that process, they deprive opportunities for small and medium companies. It doesn't mean that there is no hope for small and medium companies. They still have areas where they can find opportunities, but chaebol is already strangulating a very big part of the economy. So if you look at the American economy, for example, when I was growing up, your age, it was dominated by ExxonMobil, General Motors, General Electric, that kind of companies. Now it's totally different, right? Apple, Amazon, Facebook, and Google, totally different. But in Korea, Samsung, Hyundai, LG, SK, all the same. The only big business group that has arisen in the relatively recent past is Naver. And that is because this is totally new area, right? So there are going to be, I'm sure, newly opening opportunities, but the dynamism, as if the chaebol continues to have a tight grip on big part of the economy, the dynamism suffers to that much. Fertility questions. What's the solution? Well, there is no quick fix. The government has been pouring astronomical amounts of money in the name of this fertility policy to no avail. Why? Because the fundamental problem is the economic structure. The skyrocketing housing price. So unless you have a secure and relatively well-paying job, or you have a chunk of money given to you by your parents, you are afraid to start a family. So I think we really need to have a fundamental shift in housing policy. I would start by increasing taxes on land ownership very much. Actually, it is very low in Korea. And so having, unless you can afford to have a big house, you should not, right? And this speculative demand for housing should be killed. And the long-lasting and most fundamental policies increasing taxes. But of course, the government has not been doing that, and that is why it's in such a big trouble. And then there are other policies that can help good maternity leave and the leave for child rearing, that kind of things can help. And that's probably one of the reasons why Sejong City, where I work, has highest fertility rate in Korea, because there are a lot of government jobs, and government jobs, you are entitled to maternity leave, parental leave, and all kinds of benefits are there. So without much pressure from your peers or your superiors. So both economic policies and social policies need to change. Government's initiative. Governments, as I said, the government poured in a lot of money, giving some incentive to the third child. If you actually, I don't know much about this, because I have a son and a daughter. They're not interested in marriage, much less in having children. So I'm not personally interested in this issue, but they have tried to give incentives for couples to get married and to have children. But those, unless you change the more fundamental structure of the economy, those kind of tinkering policies have proven to be quite useless. Constructing apartments and giving them to citizens in installments. Well, some. Korea Housing Corporation has been doing that to some extent. But the relative to demand, that supply has been very limited. Why doesn't the government control the marriage spending of families? And well, there there are some things that need to be left to private decisions and those kind of things. Although extravagant marriages and a lot of wastes associated marriage ceremonies have been considered a social problem, but that's not necessarily the thing to be controlled by the government. Real impact of COVID-19. Well, nobody knows when the pandemic is going to finally put to an end, but experts tell us that we are likely to suffer from the pandemic for at least a year from now, and there'll be a lot of pain, and we'll have to make structural adjustments. Companies will have to make changes. Our lifestyles must be changing, and we are already changing, And like this, at this moment, I'm instead of face-to-face lecture, I'm seeing you on the monitor, and some businesses on the support of the government, they are waiting for the pandemic to be over, but I think that is a mistake. We are going to have a very new kind of world once the pandemic is over. So we really need to adapt to this new world, and digitalization and this trend that we call the fourth industrial revolution is going to happen with lightning speed. So everybody, every business, every corporation must be making the utmost efforts to adapt to this new world, in my view. Cutting edge innovation. Well, we are making, as I said, we are making many cutting edge innovation, but not nearly as much as we would expect from the amount of R&D investment, the number of researchers, and the extent of efforts that we are making. And the most value-creating innovations are the ones that have to do with more basic science. And I don't know the English expression, but the really breakthrough innovations have not been happening in Korea, unfortunately. We are making innovations, let's say, on the surface. And those are innovations that are maybe closer to consumers, so we can notice. But the really big money is in more fundamental technologies. But that's where we are really underperforming. And that is why we need to change the educational culture completely. I mentioned that all these, investment, education, government policies, company management practices have all been developed during the period of rapid industrialization based on catching up, importing advanced technologies. And that is, our education is still, digesting a lot of, existing knowledge and maybe making some applications. but delving deep and critical reflection and trying new things and trial and error, those kind of things have not been encouraged. Getting the right answer to the specific questions, that kind of, if you focus on that, it's very difficult to delve very deep into the fundamental questions. And I'm amazed by the young Korean people who are doing a lot of creative things in the cultural sphere, but in the scientific sphere, in the technology sphere, our innovation have still been relatively on the surface level, not really fundamental level. And if we want to make a big progress in this area, we are making progress, but very, very slow from the teacher, but on their own, finding resources that are available in the cyberspace. And maybe teachers, I'm saying that teachers need to turn into coaches, not injecting knowledge, but helping students learn on their own. Okay, let's stop here. Well, bye-bye. Thank you for sticking to the last minute.